Here are 3 things that everyone should be doing to extend their lifespan. Hi, I'm Dr. Chris Masterjohn. I have a PhD in nutritional sciences, and this is my perspective on the big unlocks for longevity. So first, I want to tell you what you shouldn't be doing. And the first thing that we shouldn't be doing is taking bad lessons from animal studies. So is mortality a universal principle? Well, what we can say is that there are different animals that experience mortality in radically different ways. So if you look on the left, we see C. elegans, which is a worm the length of 1 millimeter as an adult, usually looked at microscopically, which lives longer when it spends more time in a dormant dour state from lack of food. Now, humans do not go into a state of dormancy when we aren't well fed. And so we are not like this worm at all. And yet this worm is easy to study, and it's easy to study for lifespan because it doesn't live that long. And so a lot of the core theories about longevity that we have are actually taken from this worm. Now you can look at Turritopsis dohrnii, the immortal jellyfish on the right, and you see an animal with a radically different experience of longevity. So this is a biologically immortal jellyfish that uses a process called transdifferentiation to revert to an earlier life stage when under stress. And so you can kill the jellyfish by destroying it. You know, a predator could eat it, but if it's left to its own devices, it will just go back in time to an earlier life stage whenever it starts to get old, and it is immortal in principle. So here we can see that it's very difficult to take any particular animal's principle of longevity and mortality when they're so different. And if we go to something like lab mice, we have a mammal that is way closer to humans than either the jellyfish or the worm. But they also, because of the context that they live in, die in radically different ways from humans. So lab mice live in specific pathogen-free facilities in environments that are treated almost like surgical rooms for cleanliness. If you've taken care of mice or rats in a lab, you know what I'm talking about. You walk into a room and you have to change your clothes in that room. You're not allowed to take the changing clothes backwards or forwards, and then you go in there with foot coverings and with a freshly cleaned lab coat on. And then on top of that, you have all kinds of high quality air filtration inside the facility to protect both the humans from allergens as well as the animals from pathogens. And then you got a vet that's on call 24/7. If there's anything wrong with the animal, they're right there to it. And what they get fed, if the researchers are not trying to make them get sick and not trying to make them die early, and if the researchers aren't killing them, the default baseline diet that they get has decades of research behind it as the biochemically optimized diet for the lab mouse or for the lab rat. And this is very different from the human society, where we are exposed to all kinds of injuries and stressors and pathogens, where we can choose to eat something that deviates from the optimal diet for us. And so as a result, if researchers are not sacrificing them to end the experiment and analyze their tissues and they let them die, they will die of something much closer to old age than what most humans will go through. Most of us humans die of some specific cause that is not simply old age. And in all likelihood, people who do die of old age actually die of something. So this is a quote from a compilation of research called Human Longevity, Individual Life Duration, and the Growth of the Oldest Old Population. It says, as for identifiability of cause of death, Cohn in 1982 reviewed autopsy results of more than 200 decedents at age 85 and over, and reported that a clear manifestation of specific diseases was lacking in at least 30% of the cases. He proposed, therefore, senescence should be accepted as a cause of death. This argument was not supported by later studies that identified specific causes for most deaths among the extremely aged. In other words, even when humans do die of apparently old age, they're actually dying of something that has a defined cause. And so this brings into question how much we should rely on the general concept of senescence as in the natural and irrevocable trajectory towards essentially the life of a cell coming to an end. And so we can, when we try to look at things from a very generic concept of senescence, we're looking at, well, why do cells have a lifespan? But if you look at something like the immortal jellyfish, you can realize that that's not necessarily going to drive mortality of the organism, because the cells that can no longer live their lifespan can be replaced as long as there's stem cells left to replace them. And in some organisms, those stem cells don't last as long. As stem cells decline over time, but this jellyfish can go backwards, and so therefore the organism doesn't die. So the fact that there exists a trajectory towards greater and greater entropy in the universe, and that things tend to wear out, and that cells tend to die of a general principle of wear and tear too much over time, this does not irrevocably lead to mortality from that cause. And so one of the lessons that we want to take is that we don't want to look for the commonalities in what make lab animals die of old age. We want to understand the specific causes of human death, of human life into old age, and of humans being healthy or unhealthy over the course of their lifespan in the real world. And we want to work from those principles. Now, here's another thing we shouldn't do. So this is the effect of calorie restriction. On the left are male mice, on the right are female mice, and each bar represents a different strain of mouse. And if the bar goes up, this means that calorie restriction lengthened the life of that strain. And if the bar goes down, that means that calorie restriction decreased the lifespan of that strain. And what you can see is that for both male and female, you have, number one, enormous variation in the different strains. And number two, you actually have more strains in both cases who have their lifespan hurt by calorie restriction rather than have their lifespan helped by it. And so the lesson we get from this is that we shouldn't assume calorie restriction is going to work the same in mice and humans, or between one human and another, if it doesn't work the same between one strain of mice and another. The arguments about protein intake are largely taken from the same source as the arguments about calorie restriction. And these have their origins in the worm C. elegans that I showed you before, whose longevity is driven by the amount of time that it spends in a dormant state, because it's choosing to be dormant instead of living, so it's using less life. And one of the hypotheses that came out of C. elegans research was the IGF-1 hypothesis, or insulin-like growth factor 1. And one of the mechanistic arguments is that protein increases insulin-like growth factor 1, but the relationship to protein, if you actually look epidemiologically, it's not consistent. It depends on age, it depends on lots of things, and it can be up or it can be down. The most robust correlate with IGF-1 in humans is actually body mass. And we already know that people should optimize their body composition by losing weight if they are overweight. And so it doesn't really add anything to the many reasons to optimize your body composition. Now, if you look at optimizing body composition research, we need a good 1.2 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight protein intake per day, which is considerably higher than what most advocates of protein restriction for longevity advocate, and is higher than the RDA. And the main other argument for this is that in the blue zones, people eat less meat and they live longer lives. And there's lots that could be said about that. I don't want to get into it because I'm not an expert in the ethnographic literature. But there are many reasons for the long lives in the blue zones that include social, lifestyle, and genetic factors. One very interesting hypothesis is that these societies give a function and a purpose to people of older age, and our society really doesn't. And that brings to mind, I have a bachelor's degree in history, by the way, so it's a side interest of mine. That brings to mind the story of how Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both died on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And Adams' famous last words were, "Jefferson lives," but he was wrong because Jefferson had actually died a few hours before he did. And that speaks to the point of how purpose can extend our lives, because if we believe that we have a reason to keep living, we will. And they believed that their reason to keep living was to see the 50th anniversary of the new nation that they had created. So the lesson from this is don't use weak evidence to limit protein intake. So what should we be doing for longevity? I'm going to argue that the three things that everyone should be doing are: number one, hit the low-hanging fruit; number two, optimize your nutrient status; and number three, find your own unique super unlock. And if we want to know what the low-hanging fruit is, we need to ask the question, why do people die? So if we look at the leading causes of death in the United States, according to the CDC, we've got heart disease, cancer, the thing whose name I shall not say on YouTube because I don't want to get banned, accidents, stroke, chronic lower respiratory diseases, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, chronic liver disease and cirrhosis, and basically a collection of kidney diseases at the end. Now, some of those COVID deaths should probably be grouped with respiratory infections, and some of them should probably be grouped with accidents if it's a motorcycle accident where the person tested positive with a PCR test. But let's leave it at that and without further comment. Now, one thing that we need to understand about this is we don't all die of the same things at the same time. And what the cause of death structure in a population looks like very much depends on the progress of that society with respect to technology. So what we see here is a snapshot of US whites in the early 1990s, which basically reflects the current cause of death structure in the United States, although there are some trends that are building within this. And this graph is kind of hard to read. One of the things that you want to note, you can take a screenshot of it if you want to look at all the data. I'm not going to cover all of it. I'm just going to cover a little bit of it. But basically the gaps between the two lines represent whatever is described in the gap between the corresponding lines in the legend. And what I want to draw your attention to is basically two things. And that is that early deaths between the ages of 0 and 40, kind of peaking around age 20, these deaths are largely injuries. So external injuries that include suicides, homicides, and accidents. And then you transition to this big gap with if you take this gap and you put it together, you transition to the expansion of heart disease and cancer as the two major causes of death. Now, if we go somewhere else to India, which is in a very different position in the historical trajectory of technology and modernization, you can see a couple things. So first of all, it's kind of hard to read because the colors are so similar, but the cancer deaths, which are called neoplasms here, are red with diagonal stripes. And if you look for the red with diagonal stripes, it's very hard to find it. It's generally buried in here. So most of that red is actually cardiovascular disease and some other diseases. And there's very, very little cancer in this entire graph. So when you are in a less wealthy, less modernized state, you have a lot less cancer death. And then you can see that these big expansions on the bottom are infectious diseases occurring in the young. So as you go up in this graph, you're going from young to old. And as you widen out, you're looking at a greater percentage of contribution to the deaths. So basically what you see is a very large base in young people dying of infectious diseases. And then you have a much more moderate expansion of deaths in older age, which is primarily an expansion of heart disease. And you're not seeing much cancer there. Now, if you look at the United States from 2003 shown on the left to 2015 shown on the right, you also see that the United States is currently in an epidemiological transition from heart disease to cancer as the leading cause of death and to a longer life expectancy. So the key things to look at in this graph to visually perceive this is that red represents heart disease, blue represents cancer, and white represents a lower mortality rate. And so what you can see is that in 2003, the United States, it looks very red, and the map looks much less red on the right. You can see that the map on the right is characterized by blue and white taking over for the red. So what that means is that people are living longer and they are shifting from heart disease to cancer as the leading cause of death, which essentially means that they are living long enough to get cancer instead of dying earlier of heart disease. Now, the last graph of this nature that I want to show you looks at how we are in the midst of an emerging trend that is starting to emerge as the trend I just showed you is continuing toward completion. And what this trend generally is showing is that as cardiovascular disease deaths go on the decline, we are not only getting more cancer, but now we are also starting to get a greater diversity of deaths where they are now being replaced by genital and urinary disorders, mental and behavioral disorders, and neurological diseases. So what the graph on the left shows you is life expectancy at birth is plotted on the horizontal axis, and cause of death variation is plotted on the vertical axis. And all the lines lead up and to the right. And so what that means is that as people live longer in the society, they die of a greater diversity of causes of death. Now, on the right, you can see that lifespan variation is on the horizontal axis and cause of death variation is again plotted on the vertical axis. And all these lines are going down to the right. And what that's showing you is that as the cause of death variation goes up, because people are living longer, as shown on the left graph, then what is happening is that the variation in how long people live is going down. And what that means is it is converging on a naturally long life. Now, I would argue that what is happening is that the effects of the Industrial Revolution, and we could even argue to some extent agriculture as well, but especially the Industrial Revolution, are now starting to wear off because finally technology is starting to solve the problems that it had created. So if you look at the general historical trend, what you see is that in the 19th century, and we really only have high quality death records in certain societies starting in the early 19th century. So for example, in the UK, we have very excellent mortality data starting around 1815. Everything before that, we have records of, the average family where it was recorded, so many children were born, so many children died. We have things like that for the 1700s, but we don't have complete mortality data sets until the 19th century. And so this is where cause of death data gets very good, or starts to get good. And in the 19th century, tuberculosis was the major killer. When tuberculosis was solved, other infections became the major killers between 1900 and 1945. As the infections stopped killing people in modernized societies, cardiovascular disease and cancer took over. At first, it was more cardiovascular disease than cancer, but the trend since those two diseases took over, the trend over time has been that we get better and better at solving heart attacks in the emergency room, which makes heart attacks not necessarily kill someone, which makes them live long enough to get cancer. And then as people are living longer and longer, because we get better and better at eliminating heart disease deaths, and we start to get okay at decreasing cancer deaths, we now allow a diversity of causes to start killing people, which essentially means we're getting closer and closer to people starting to die of natural causes in old age, but we also have better data science and better diagnostics. So now we are able to attribute causes of death in those things. Now, the reason that I say that this is essentially getting rid of finally resolving the effects of the Industrial Revolution is that if we go back to the Bible, it says that in the Psalms that the years of man are 70, or if by reason of strength, fourscore, which basically means that at that time, humans were living 70 to 80 years long. That was considered a good life. And if you look at the 1700s and the 1800s, we had massive infant mortality. There were cities that had 75% infant mortality in Europe in the 1700s going into the 1800s. And so what was happening was, if you go back to hunter-gatherer days, so even before the biblical days, before agriculture, humans lived more spread out. And so infectious diseases were not, they were not as universal in hunter-gatherer days as they were in the 1700s and 1800s. What happened is that agriculture created, first domesticating animals allowed transmission of zoonotic diseases from animals to humans, and then crowding in urban centers during agriculture allowed greater population density, which allowed humans to spread infectious diseases to each other. But really, you ain't seen nothing until you got to the Industrial Revolution, where you had much greater population density and crowding, but you also had a transition from the farmer who had their own cow and got fresh milk to the laborers in the city who got milk from whiskey distillery waste fed cows that was filled with pus and was transported to them with no refrigeration, and then was kept on their windowsill in the heat with no refrigeration for a week. And if you look at those days, what you see is that people were wondering whether vegetables were the key cause of infant mortality. Why were they wondering if vegetables were the key cause of infant mortality? Because in the summer, you had 4 to 5-fold greater deaths of infants. And what did people eat in the summer? They ate vegetables. Well, the other thing that was happening in the summer was that it was hotter and the milk was spoiling faster, and the pus that was in the milk from the cows fed the whiskey distillery waste who had mastitis, which was pouring pathogenic bacteria into the milk, then could multiply to an infectious dose at a much greater rate to kill the people who were drinking it. And so then we cleaned up the milk and we did other things that started to fix that. We developed antibiotics and all kinds of things that I'm going to go into shortly. But that high mortality rate was not natural. And then we transitioned into a society of sedentariness because of our technology, and we developed highly palatable foods and made it easy to become obese and made it easy to move from highly nutritious foods to less nutrient dense foods and so on. And that, as we get rid of infectious diseases, all those things emerge and cardiovascular disease and cancer emerges. And only now are we finally starting to overcome the effects of those processes to lead to almost universally longer lives where people are dying of more diverse causes. Now, what's shown on the screen is the importance of nutrition. I'm going to give some data to back this up. But when in the 19th century, when we got rid of tuberculosis, we did it with nutrition. In 1900 to 1945, when we got rid of the other infections, we did it with nutrition. Post-World War II, we transitioned to antibiotics and we forgot nutrition. And then we transitioned to vaccines and we further forgot nutrition. And this solidified the fact that our nutrition has been poor. And what I'm going to show you is that had we kept our focus on nutrition, the nutrition that helped get rid of tuberculosis and infections would also have prevented cardiovascular disease and cancer from becoming the big killers that they are. And that would have gotten us much faster to a state of having diverse underlying causes of naturally long lifespans. So this is a slide from the Royal Brompton Hospital's data in the middle of the 19th century that shows before and after the introduction of cod liver oil as a treatment for tuberculosis. And what you can see in the middle is that roughly 60% or a little higher had no change in their condition both before and after cod liver oil. The red represents before cod liver oil. The green represents after cod liver oil is used as a treatment. But what's really important is that on the left, you see a 44% decline in the number of people who deteriorated or died. And that came with a tripling of the number of people who experienced complete resolution. And so this is not giving cod liver oil to the general population as a preventative. This is giving people cod liver oil who are in the hospital on their deathbed, and it is causing a massive decrease in the people who are deteriorating or dying and a massive increase in the number of people who are fully getting better. Now, in the 1920s, especially in 1930s, there were a number of clinical trials that showed that cod liver oil could prevent infectious diseases, and I'm only going to show you a tiny handful of those. So this is data showing that cod liver oil decreased the incidence of colds, and this is data from the same study that showed that cod liver oil cut in half the number of hours missed from work because of colds. And then this is a study showing that cod liver oil concentrate reduced measles mortality by over half. If we blow up the data, we can see the difference much greater here. There are also data showing that it decreases the incidence of measles, that it decreases the incidence and mortality of bedside fever, and so on. And because of that, vitamin A became known as the anti-infective vitamin, and cod liver oil became massively consumed as a means of decreasing morbidity and mortality from the common infectious diseases. So, for example, these are ads from that time for cod liver oil, and you can see these ads say, whooping cough, measles, mumps, chickenpox, scarlet fever may do greater harm than most mothers think. So what's the solution? Get squib cod liver oil, because then your kid can be exposed to these diseases but not be killed or maimed by them. And the cod liver oil can reduce these illnesses to mild and almost trivial infections. And so what happened was, if you look at cod liver oil imports, they increased 25-fold from about 2 million pounds to 50 million pounds from the 1920s through the start of World War II. And then World War II cuts off the imports, so it goes down to almost zero. Then there's a dead cat bounce and it trails off. So what happened after World War II? This is when antibiotics came in. And so it's not that everyone immediately forgot about cod liver oil, but it's like that saying that science evolves as one generation dies and the next generation takes over. Well, this is a negative implementation of that concept, right? The people who first experienced antibiotics still remembered cod liver oil, but as antibiotics became popular and people wanted to do easier things for their children, they stopped thinking about cod liver oil as much, and then it got forgotten from history to the point where by the 1960s, this is of course where vaccines are really starting to take over. Antibiotics and vaccines taking over basically pushes cod liver out. And so what happens is you have massive declines in the intakes of vitamins A and D after antibiotics and vaccines push nutrition out of the minds of people. And that's not to say that no one knew what they were, or that nutrition scientists weren't promoting the knowledge of vitamins A and D, that they weren't in textbooks, that people weren't taught about them in school. But it is to say that the intakes of them massively declined because there was not an emphasis on you should get enough vitamin A and D to protect your child from being killed or maimed by these common infectious diseases. Now, if you look at the historical trends, you can see that this is for the UK, where vaccination was introduced at the end of the decline of tuberculosis mortality. And cod liver oil was starting to be used as a treatment at the beginning of that decline. We really can't say whether it was already in decline or not, but this graph is certainly consistent with the use of cod liver oil as a treatment being at the beginning of the decline, and the identification of the fat-soluble vitamins being in the middle of the decline, and vitamin A as an anti-infective, and therefore cod liver oil intakes dramatically increasing, further pushing that down. They didn't have chemotherapy until after that. And in the United States, there was never a vaccination introduced for tuberculosis, and we still eradicated it. And if you look at measles, you see something kind of similar. So there was no data from the 1800s where they were using cod liver oil to treat measles, but when they identified the fat-soluble vitamins, that marks the beginning of the decline, the historical decline in measles mortality. Vitamin A as an anti-infective is basically introduced in the beginning there. Immunization comes when the mortality from measles is almost completely gone. Now, if you were to look at a graph of the incidence of measles, what you would see is that it actually stays high, and then the immunization is introduced, and then it falls off a cliff. But what that means is that when the fat-soluble vitamins were promoted for reducing measles incidence and mortality, measles became a largely non-fatal disease. And then the vaccine came and wiped out the incidence of what vitamin A from cod liver oil had made a largely non-fatal disease. Okay, so if we go back here, this basically brings us to 1945, where cardiovascular disease and cancer are now taking over because nutrition had pushed out tuberculosis and other infections. Now let's look at whether the low-hanging fruit that was used against the infections, such as cod liver oil, could have been helpful in cardiovascular disease and cancer. Now, if we look at the leading causes of death in the United States according to the CDC, we can kind of group these into cardiovascular disease and cancer at the top, then respiratory infections, then a cluster of diseases associated with diabetes, liver disease, and kidney disease, then accidents, and then Alzheimer's disease. If we take out the external injuries, the accidents, I want to show you how this low-hanging fruit really could have been key against all of these causes of death. So if we look at what vitamins A and D do, one of the main things that they do is they help maintain the cell's proper identity. This is a process called cellular differentiation. This helps with immunity against pathogens, with prevention of autoimmunity, and with prevention of cancer. Why? Well, the immune system, if you get sick, you have a massive increase in immune cells called emergency myelopoiesis, where the bone marrow has a 100-fold increase in the production of blood cells that are important for immunity. It's vitamins A and D that help them become the cells that fight off the immune system. If you don't have those vitamins there, you are not going to be able to differentiate those cells in that emergency. Vitamins A and D also help differentiate cells so that the immune system will attack the proper target. And that includes attacking the pathogen instead of the cell, and it also includes attacking the cancer. But then on top of this, cellular differentiation using vitamins A and D is also very important for cells to not become cancerous in the first place, because they're supposed to know their place and be the right type of cell. So with cancer, you have both a preventing cancerous development factor, and you also have stimulating the immune system to attack the right thing, including the cancer aspect of cellular differentiation. If we look at cardiovascular disease and kidney disease, these share a component of soft tissue calcification. Vitamins A, D, and K2 cooperate to prevent soft tissue calcification, and so are helpful against both those clusters of diseases. If we look at another component of cardiovascular risk, we have oxidative damage to lipoproteins, which is a more nuanced view of what many people would call high cholesterol or hyperlipoproteinemia or elevated ApoB. What's really going on is the lipoproteins are getting damaged. And we have factors such as obesity or underweight, stress, and inflammation that will decrease thyroid hormone activity, which controls the metabolic rate and controls the rate of the LDL receptor uptake of lipoproteins, which is what clears them from the blood and prevents them from being damaged. Now, if they stay too long in the blood, they can get damaged. Another factor on this is deficiencies of micronutrients. So thyroid micronutrients are iron, protein, iodine, and selenium, and also the antioxidant nutrients that are shown on the right. But if you have obesity or underweight, you have stress and you have inflammation, you're decreasing your thyroid activity. You're further decreasing it if you have a deficiency of the thyroid-specific nutrients. The antioxidant nutrients are important to the thyroid, but they're also important to prevent lipoproteins from oxidizing. So if your thyroid activity is low, you have slow metabolism of lipoproteins. They spend longer time in the blood. They spend longer time in the blood vessel where they can get damaged, and you have damage is more likely to occur if you have a deficiency in antioxidant nutrients. And these antioxidant nutrients are listed here. That's protein, vitamin Z and C, selenium, zinc, copper, iron, sulfur, and manganese. And what happens when you have slow metabolism of lipoproteins and an increased risk of damage is you get oxidative damage to lipoproteins, and that contributes to cardiovascular disease. Now, another disease on the list, which is also interlocked with these because diabetics have a higher risk of dying of heart disease for example, is diabetes. And diabetes, type 1 diabetes, can largely be considered an autoimmune disease and is covered in the first slide I gave you on autoimmunity. Type 2 diabetes is largely driven by obesity and sedentariness as positive risk factors, and then deficiencies of antioxidant nutrients or energy metabolism nutrients. And these are many. So I had just given you the antioxidant nutrients. We'll repeat all those here. And then we'll add the energy metabolism micronutrients are all the B vitamins, all the electrolytes. So that's sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, bicarbonate, and phosphate. Iron, copper, molybdenum, and sulfur. And when you have these combinations, you're more likely to get type 2 diabetes. And then fatty liver disease is driven by visceral abdominal fat, dietary fat, sugar, or alcohol as positive inputs to liver fat. Liver fat is largely an in-out equation. If you have visceral abdominal fat, some people gain more visceral abdominal fat than others. But generally speaking, whenever anyone is overweight, they will always have more visceral abdominal fat. And whenever they are obese, they will always have a lot more visceral abdominal fat. Because the visceral abdominal fat goes directly into the portal vein, which goes directly into the liver, when it gets released, it is automatic 100% liver fat in. And that will tax the fat out part of the equation to a much greater degree than dietary fat, which will go into the lymph from the intestine and then to the general circulation before it reaches the liver, which means that not all of it goes to the liver. Similarly, visceral abdominal fat is going to be worse than sugar or alcohol, which can contribute to the synthesis of fat within the liver. In the case of sugar, primarily, alcohol is probably contributing to fatty liver primarily through oxidative damage in the liver. But in any case, these will contribute to fat accumulating in the liver, but not 100% of them become liver fat. And so for those reasons, visceral abdominal fat is actually the first and most important thing. It's numero uno that you want to look for as a risk factor for fatty liver disease. And this is supported by the epidemiology. The vast majority of people with fatty liver disease are overweight. The vast majority of overweight and obese people have fatty liver disease. And then a deficiency of choline, which is needed to make phosphatidylcholine, which is needed to make the membrane of the lipoproteins that will carry the triglycerides, which are fat molecules, out of the liver. And then antioxidant nutrients are very important to protect the ApoB from being oxidatively damaged within the liver, which will hurt the removal of those fat molecules or triglycerides. And the antioxidant nutrients are the same ones that I had given you before: protein, vitamins E and C, selenium, zinc, copper, iron, sulfur, and manganese. And so when you have too many of the positive risk factors, not enough of the protective factors, you wind up with fatty liver disease. High blood pressure is largely, from a dietary perspective, is most importantly influenced by the salt to potassium ratio. Other risk factors include stress, alcohol, and sedentariness. And if we look at Alzheimer's disease, this is a figure from the paper that's cited in the lower right corner. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that the positive risk factors that are thought to be preventable that are on the left, and keeping in mind that the key drivers are ApoE4 status, female status, and old age, but the modifiable risk factors, the ones that will help you prevent Alzheimer's, are really type 2 diabetes, blood pressure, dyslipidemia, midlife obesity, cardiovascular disease. So many of these things are the same cluster of risk factors for the other things that we were talking about, that this really represents just another manifestation of the collection of these modifiable risk factors. So if we come back here, one key point that I want to make is that the medical model did more harm than good in some respects. So I would say that the two greatest achievements in this entire slide are the elimination of whiskey distillery pus-filled unrefrigerated milk. That was one accomplishment that can be attributed to the mainstream medical movement, you could argue. And then the second one would be emergency treatment of heart attacks. And then everything else is kind of right? Because if we had used the same nutrition in the modern era post-1945 that we were using to get rid of infectious disease mortality before that, we would have a lower burden of cardiovascular disease and cancer, we'd have a lower burden of diabetes, of fatty liver disease, of kidney disease, and so on. We would have a lower burden of all the leading causes of death according to the CDC in the United States, and we would be well on our way to having diverse causes of death happen at naturally, appropriately old age. And then we could, and notice that these are more variable because they're more idiosyncratic, and we could be focusing our attention on understanding the individual idiosyncrasies that are limiting bottlenecks for longevity after you get rid of these things that were universal early killers of humans in the context of mid-technology, mid-modernization mid-technology, mid-modernization Western society. Okay, so how can we harness this low-hanging fruit? Well, let's talk about some of these vitamins that were so important. Cod liver oil was the form of vitamins A and D used in the mid-1800s and early 1900s. But we can also get vitamin A from the liver. We can get yellow, orange, red, and green vegetables give us carotenoids, which can be converted into vitamin A. Smaller amounts of vitamin A are found in eggs and butter. All these animal sources of vitamin A are providing retinol, which is preformed vitamin A, in the physiological form that we need. The vegetables are providing carotenoids, which need to be converted into vitamin A. One of the idiosyncrasies in limiting bottlenecks of longevity that is actually rather common is that around a quarter of people are genetically bad at making the conversion from plant foods to vitamin A. And so if you want to play the probability game, you would probably want to say, I'm going to get 50 to 75% of my vitamin A from these animal foods, because then you need to think a lot less about, am I good or bad about making that conversion? If you are committed to being a vegan, for example, and you're left with these, whether you can make that conversion might determine part of the degree to which vitamin A becomes a limiting bottleneck for your longevity. Vitamin D can be gotten from cod liver oil, but it can also be gotten from fatty fish and from sunshine, smaller amounts in butter and eggs if they are pastured. And this is showing you a few different ways to get enough vitamin K2. So if we look at the requirement, we want 1 to 200 micrograms of vitamin K2 per day to realize most of the benefits. That can be gotten from 6 to 12 ounces of dark chicken meat, but not light chicken meat, 5 to 9 ounces of hard cheese, 1 to 2 ounces of goose liver, 1/3 to 2/3 of an ounce of natto. And then below that, it shows the different ways to mix and match these foods to get a day's intake. This is taken from the vitamin K2, the ultimate vitamin K2 resource. You can get that at chrismasterjohnphd.com/K2. So we know the power of cod liver oil. That was a simple supply of 2 key vitamins in moving away the infectious disease burden of the past. And so there are definitely simple low-hanging fruit, but we need to broaden our perspective, because you can't be deficient in any given nutrient, because as I showed you, there are many roles for many nutrients in many of these other diseases. So in order to try to optimize your nutrition without thinking too much, as long as you tolerate all these foods, these are some key principles that will help you get most vitamins and minerals that you need from your food, most macronutrients that you need from your food, while keeping simple rules. So first of all, eat 1/3 of your plate as protein and diversify your protein across meat, poultry, fish, shellfish, dairy, and eggs. Number 2, eat nose to tail, or at least try to start incorporating that principle by including 4 to 8 ounces of liver per week and bone broth each day. Number 3, eat 1/3 of your plate as red, orange, yellow, and green vegetables, always including some dark greens. Number 4, get several servings per day of calcium-rich foods, such as dairy, bones, or cruciferous veggies like kale and broccoli. And then number 5, if you want to try to make a natural multivitamin, the best way to do that is 1 or 2 ounces of liver, 1 or 2 oysters or clams, or better yet, an oyster and a clam, a tablespoon of unfortified nutritional yeast, and a source of vitamin C, such as bell peppers, will help make sure that you get most of what you need. Now, there are other low-hanging fruit. I'm focusing on nutrition, and that especially incorporates eating a well-rounded, nutrient-dense diet, and maintaining a healthy body composition. The other things on this list are things that I believe that will contribute to longevity. Some of them have a lot of evidence. Some of them are more speculative. A lot of evidence for living an active lifestyle with healthy movement patterns and plenty of outdoor time. Plenty of good amount of evidence indirectly that getting outdoor sunshine in the morning and avoiding artificial light at night. Speculative include exposure to fire. This is a natural source of far infrared light that we would be exposed to in the past that completes the infrared spectrum of the sunshine. Let our bare skin touch the earth. Some evidence that that's good for you. Not quite longevity, but it makes a lot of sense to me. Experience the transitions between hot and cold that nature offers. Very similar, although a larger evidence basis than for barefoot grounding. Sleep well. Plenty of evidence for this. Take bites of life only as big as we can chew, but always be taking bites. Nourish positive relationships with our family and friends and a positive outlook within ourselves. So all gets to the heart of social connections and stress management. Good amounts for those, especially stress. Be mindful of avoiding excessive exposures to the toxins that we may encounter. All right, so that's the low-hanging fruit. Number 2 is optimize your nutrient status. This helps protect you against errors. For example, you think you're eating these types of food, but when you measure it, you're really not. It protects you against, it also protects against errors in the databases when you get to the testing component of this optimization, because the database might say that one food is high in a nutrient, but the soil might be causing that to be different. And then number 3, this helps start you in your trajectory towards understanding your own individual unique bottlenecks. You may not need to go down a full rabbit hole on why what gene is doing what in you, but you may be eating plenty of riboflavin and have low blood levels of riboflavin or high levels of a marker that goes up when riboflavin is deficient. And now you can say, I think I need more riboflavin. You put it in, you get healthier, and you solved a problem that you wouldn't have solved without the testing, but you didn't have to fully go down the rabbit hole to get that part of your progress. So the first thing that you can do is track your diet in Chronometer. That's shown on the left. Chronometer is an app that is less popular than MyFitnessPal, but much better for tracking micronutrients. You can think about food categories that provide different nutrients as you're trying to put together your diet that you could track in Chronometer, and then you can use Chronometer to help optimize it. So for example, you want to know the basics, like you're getting your protein, fat, and carbs as macronutrients, protein coming from meat, fish, dairy, eggs, and to some extent legumes, fats coming from oils, oil fruits like coconut and olives, nuts, seeds, animal fats, carbs coming from grains, tubers, legumes, fruits, high-starch vegetables. B vitamins are generally high in liver and nutritional yeast. Riboflavin is one of them. It's high in liver, but also heart, kidney, and almonds. Biotin and choline are high in liver and egg yolks, but not so much in nutritional yeast. Folate is another B vitamin found in sprouted legumes, dark greens, and pastured egg yolks, also in liver. B12 found in liver, but also clams. Vitamin A and D are from cod liver oil. Vitamin A is also found in terrestrial livers, while vitamin D is also found in oily fish. Vitamin C from acerola, amla, and especially in Western supermarkets, you'll find bell peppers. Vitamin E from red palm oil, K1 from dark greens, K2 from natto and goose liver. The 2 essential fatty acids that are most important, omega-6 arachidonic acid from liver and egg yolks, omega-3 DHA from fish and cod liver oil. Copper from liver, spirulina, and cocoa. Zinc from oysters. Iodine from kelp and other seaweed. Iron from clams. Manganese from mussels. Molybdenum from liver and legumes. Selenium from organ meats, which is more reliable than Brazil nuts. Brazil nuts, the problem is that they're very high, but they're also highly variable. Organ meats vary 2 to 5-fold. Brazil nuts vary 20-fold. And so you can get into more trouble with Brazil nuts where you think it's one level of selenium and it's a completely different one that's toxic or not enough. And selenium is one of those things where you really want to measure it because the foods are so variable. So you really want to measure your plasma selenium. Some nutrients are needed in high volumes from categories of foods, but don't have any specific superfoods. Sodium, if you're not eating processed foods, you're getting most of your sodium from added salt. Potassium is found in the lean portions of animal foods where the juice is consumed. Cook your meat in a pan, use the juice. Otherwise, you lose the potassium. I don't advocate skim milk and egg whites, but the lean portions of milk and the egg whites are where the potassium is. When you're eating full fat foods and high fat foods, you need to focus more on getting potassium from other foods. Tubers, legumes, fruits, and vegetables are a great way to round out a high-fat diet, or, well, at least the fruits and vegetables. The low-carb fruits and vegetables would be a great way to round out a high-fat diet because they don't provide they can allow you to consume many grams of fat, but also make up for it in potassium with low-calorie versions of those foods. And magnesium, you can get it from animal foods, but it's very, very much easier to get it from a full spectrum of unrefined plant foods. Now, you can put together your chronometer and you can find out, I've used my knowledge of where the nutrients come from to put together a pretty good diet. I've followed the low-hanging fruit that Chris recommended, but daily reports some low in something. A useful tool is you can click on that nutrient in order to understand where you're getting it so that you can modify your diet and optimize around the edges. For example, my potassium was not green one day. It wasn't that low, but it was a little bit low. Click on potassium, tells me where I'm getting it. Macadamia nuts, tomatoes. I can say those are my top 2 foods. What happens if I increase macadamia nuts? We can copy that day to the next day and then use the following day as a mock model of my diet and say, okay, what happens if I just increase macadamia nuts? Well, potassium goes up to where I want it, but I get fat because it's so many calories. Okay, what happens if I bring them back down and bring the tomatoes up? Oh, perfect on all fronts. And so this feature can help you optimize around the edges once you have a pretty good diet that you're tracking. To go the extra mile, you want to start testing nutritional markers. I have a full guide to this at chrismasterjohnphd.substack.com. Click on ebooks in the menu and go to Testing Nutritional Status, the Ultimate Cheat Sheet. This is my comprehensive system for managing nutritional status using signs and symptoms, dietary analysis, and lab tests. The last thing that we're going to do is find our own super unlock. And the core thesis here is that each of us have 1 to 6 mutations in our genetics that are 100 to 1,000 times more important than the other 14 million that provide unique limiters to our longevity. So the perfect example of how to show this is to look at the case of heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. The only reason we understand this is because heart disease is a leading killer and has been for decades. So we have spent decades understanding what influences its risk. And that is why we know so much about this one single metabolic disorder as a limiting bottleneck for longevity. There are hundreds of other metabolic disorders that I believe in my core thesis in the heterozygous so-called carrier state will provide similar, highly unique to the individual limiting bottlenecks to longevity, but are not well studied. And so I don't have the data to show you how they impact longevity in this way. But this is how it works for heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. So what this is showing you is that they took people with heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. Some of them had a more moderate mutation shown in the middle. Some of them had the regular mutations. This is all the other mutations combined that contribute to this disorder. And they're shown at the bottom here. And on the top is their unaffected relatives. So the unaffected relatives are largely genetically similar to them, but they don't share this mutation. And so this controls for the other genes involved. What you see is that typically heart disease maybe starts emerging a tiny bit at around the 40s in the decade of life. And then it's really after 60 that people start to die of heart disease. And as you get between age 60 to 80, you have lots of heart disease happening. And as you start to get to 80, you start to have a very substantial number of people, around the order of 30%, who have died of heart disease. Now, in heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, you start to get some people dying before they're 30. And then in the late 30s, you start to get more people dying. And then you really get in the 40s and 50s, you start getting lots of people dying of heart disease. And then they continue to die off of heart disease between that and 80. But if you look at the gap between the unaffected relatives and the people with full-blown heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, that gap is largest around the age of the late 40s into the 50s. And then it starts to close off as you get towards 80. because everyone starts to die of heart disease when they're old enough. And they can also die of cancer, but I mean the general population is also dying off of heart disease. And so what are you doing? Well, if you look at this from the perspective of the general population with heart disease being the leading killer, heterozygosity is pulling heart disease forward by about 30 years. It is forming the unique bottleneck to these people's longevity by pulling that disease forward in time. But if you look at this from the perspective of the infants with the homozygous disease, who can die of a heart attack in infancy at 18 months old, then what it's doing is it's pushing away in time that disease. And it's saying heart disease, okay, not in infancy, but we're going to start the risk in your late 20s and 30s. We're going to make that risk really start to mean something in your 30s and 40s. So if you look at it from the perspective of longevity, a heterozygous genetic metabolic disorder is pulling death forward in time by 30 or 40 years in its maximal potential effect. And if you look at it from the perspective of the homozygous disease that it is a shadow of, it's pushing death from infancy into the middle of life. So either way, what it's doing is it is becoming a limiting bottleneck for your longevity. I would argue if you took any other disease that can kill an infant and you take half of it, that also will become will pull death forward in time for you and become a limiting bottleneck for your longevity for the exact same reasons. It's just that those are representing very diverse causes rather than a leading killer like heart disease. And so we have not studied the longevity effects of all those different hundreds of metabolic disorders. Now, note that if we go back here, why are not all of the people with heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia dying of heart disease? Well, there could be many reasons, but I'm going to give you one that provides some insight. And that is that the LDL receptor is what's wrong in heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. This is defective. But the LDL receptor can't get LDL into a cell unless it moves it on a protein called dynamin, which uses energy from GTP, which takes its energy from ATP, which is made by the mitochondria in the respiratory chain. If you don't have ATP energy made by your mitochondria by turning food energy into it, you're not going to be able to use it to bring the LDL receptor into the cell. And so this shows you how any problem making ATP can interact with a metabolic disorder like heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. And a deficiency in making ATP can be any of those energy metabolism nutrients that I told you before, those micronutrient deficiencies, or it can be hundreds of metabolic problems that compromise the production of ATP. So ultimately, improving energy metabolism to the fullest requires nutritional optimization around rare genetic bottlenecks because like a simple deficiency of B vitamins, electrolytes, iron, copper, sulfur, and molybdenum, that can be involved. But there's approximately 750 nutritionally actionable genetic disorders in energy metabolism that hurt the availability of ATP and related fuel molecules with a distribution of 1 to 6 per person. Now, we could copy and paste any of these disease risks with this heterozygous metabolic disorder that we all have a few of. And I'll give you some examples of how it would impact longevity. So cardiovascular disease. Suboptimal vitamin C status could combine with a complex 1 respiratory chain disorder, which provides a unique need for a low-carb diet plus glutamine plus succinate as supplements in order to help the complex 1 problem. And so that can give you an example of where, hey, you might get your vitamin C best on a diet that's rich in fruits and vegetables, but you might not need to restrict carbs, and that can put you in a very unique spot in the way that you need to put your diet together in order to prevent your risk of cardiovascular disease. Cancer, suboptimal vitamin A intake with a defect in CoQ10 synthesis that provides a unique need for up to 3,000 milligrams per day of CoQ10, which is a very high amount. That might be needed to create the energetic metabolism that you need to activate the vitamin A. So if you have a problem in the respiratory chain because of CoQ10 deficiency, and you also have low vitamin A intake, the the respiratory chain problem will hurt your vitamin A activation and make that decrease in vitamin A intake even worse. And so that's going to aggravate the impact on the cancer risk. Diabetes, you're overweight, common risk factor, but rare risk factor. You have pyruvate dehydrogenase deficiency, which means your carbohydrate metabolism does not work in its full extent unless you have 500 to 2,000 milligrams of thiamine per day. So you have to do something that everyone has to do, and you have to do something very unique to you with the thiamine supplementation. Alzheimer's, we know that female, old age, and ApoE4 status are the main drivers, but now we also have a defect in glutathione synthesis compromising sleep. I currently have actually a client who had severe sleeping problems. He also has a genetic defect in synthesizing glutathione and severe microbiome problems that prevent him from consuming glutathione in supplements because of the sulfur. And it was glutathione infusions that allowed him to achieve normal sleep. Someone else who didn't have the microbiome problem could have used oral glutathione supplements. But the point is that your sleep, which is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, could interact with your old age ApoE4 status and female status to require you to fix it with whatever is the unique limiter to your sleep. One person's highly unique sleep bottleneck may be glutathione status, as in the case of my client. So these are all examples of how you can have common risk factors that combine with highly unique risk factors based on these 1 to 6 individual bottlenecks in each person. Now, there's 750 nutritionally actionable genetic disorders in energy metabolism that hurt the availability of ATP and related fuel molecules. As I said before, the distribution is 1 to 6 per person. This requires figuring out what they are, but I want to give you some things that you can track at home and some DIY methods to point yourself in the right direction. So one of the things that we could predict from having a unique limiting bottleneck in your metabolism is that it would be harder to maintain proper body composition if you are further away from optimizing around that unique bottleneck. So if you measure your weight, your waist circumference, this can allow you to experiment with things that make it easier to achieve normal body composition. I'm not saying go lose weight. I'm saying experiment with dietary changes to see what makes achieving optimal body composition more effortless. Track your diet like I was talking about before. Create subjective health scores. Track your sleep. Sleep could be part of your health score, but maybe you have it could be a sign or a symptom of something bad, or it could be a metric of something that you're trying to achieve. Maybe it's a number of hours that you can stay focused at work as a positive thing, or it could be, are my hands tingling as a negative thing, or whatever is important to you about your health. Create a quantitative score about it. Rank yourself on it. If needed, if you're tracking many of those things, create an aggregate score. Make some simple number that can track how you go up and down in your health over time. And glucose, ketones, and lactate, these are very powerful markers. My experience is that many people who are trying to solve health problems benefit most from the lactate measurement, not after exercise, but waking up in the morning, what's your lactate? These ketones and lactate put glucose into context. Glucose versus ketones tells you, are you burning carbs versus the alternative of fat? Lactate tells you, what are you doing with the glucose? Are you metabolizing it through oxidative phosphorylation, or do you have a backup in your metabolism of that so you're converting it into lactate? And when you put glucose into context, you can learn so much more. So one of the things that you can do at home is a DIY method to try to get closer to finding your super unlock is to start shifting your macros and micros one at a time. Use a combination of subjective and objective measurements to judge whether each thing is hurting or helping. So for example, my lactate went up, my sleep went down, I feel worse today. That's a combination of objective measures, subjective measures that are in agreement that can tell you that what you're doing might be hurting you. And so you can then reverse course, but you have to test things one at a time in order to do this properly. Now, I have much more detail about how to use comprehensive genomic and biochemical testing to, with precision, find your health super unlock in my article called How I Found My Health Super Unlock After 20 Years of Research and 20,000 Genes Tested. So go to chrismasterjohnphd.substack.com to find that article. It's also available there in video form. That in itself is a whole hour plus topic to cover. So I'd like to leave you with that and just say, take these things, the low-hanging fruit, the nutritional optimization, and some home methods to go in the direction of your super unlock. And then if you really want to go to the next level, check out this article and video, How I Found My Health Super Unlock, to unleash the full power of step 3 for your longevity.